And so it's more than just like a casual deep dive. It's like something that I've actually been using in my own personal growth, is the selves. May have mentioned it on other podcasts, but I don't know if I have. So I want to start with self-esteem, because just like self-awareness is the foundation for everything. Like, we have to be able to see and perceive ourselves in all these different contexts to do any work. I think self-esteem is also like one layer up of foundation. So part of really getting into good definitions around this is looking at the etymology of the words themselves. Where do they come from? What was the original intent and meaning of this word, and how did it end up influencing how we see it now? So esteem comes from the same word as estimate, right? Or another word could be survey. To esteem something is to sort of understand the terrain of it and to be able to measure it. So self-esteem is, how are you measuring yourself, right? How are you taking in an accounting or a survey of who and what you are in terms of value? So self-esteem, the really important question underneath self-esteem isn't whether or not it's good or bad. It's, what are the metrics you're using? Are you aware of how you are estimating yourself or surveying yourself? Are you using these overly, idealistic metrics? Are you supposed to be perfect? Are you supposed to be, like what instruments are you using to measure that?
Yeah.
What are the metrics themselves? And so if you have a lack of clarity around how you are esteeming yourself and what you're using to guide that, then you can say good or bad, but it's like, that doesn't mean anything.
Yeah.
It just, it's going, well, that's a junk piece of territory. And it's like, well, how did you determine that? Like, is it because it's good or bad farmland? Is it because it's not, what?
Yeah.
How are you determining whether or not something is good or bad? And if we're unaware of what our metrics are, then that's a meaningless statement.
So you put it in a very binary frame, good or bad. But the image I call up when we talk about self-esteem, immediately that comes up to me is the idea of the estimation of a house I want to purchase. So there's a purchase price. Let's say a house is valued at $500,000, $500,000. That's the price on the house that somebody might want to purchase. You hire an estimator to come and give an estimated value of that house. It actually might be worth more than what the purchase price is. And I think the estimator takes in two broad categories. The first is the actual physical property itself, like the building materials, the house, the wiring, the electric, the property size, the water, sewage, like all the things that make the system of the house and the property valuable. Like they take that into account to estimate it. But there's another factor in real estate. They also take into account it's like relation to the value of other homes around it in the neighborhood and close by. So there's almost like an absolute value metric or estimation based on the material costs and the things that went into building the house and the property. And then there's a relational estimation on its related value. Probably location comes into this too. Like if it's a beachfront property, that might be higher than the exact same setup inland, for example. And then it's also going to take into fact, is it beachfront property in like a really crappy part of town along the beach, or is it next to super big mansions and it has a lot of estimated value there? So could we say that personal self-esteem has those same two factors, an absolute estimation of self, as well as an estimation in relation to others? Mm-hmm. In other words, if I'm like, my self-esteem is I am in a tribe 200,000 years ago, and I've overcome a lot in this little small tribe. So I'm like the top of the tribe. And so I have an absolute estimation. I'm competent, I'm capable. And yet, if I took myself from 200,000 years ago, brought myself to modern times, maybe in relative estimation, I'm not that great. Like I can do I can kill for my food and make a hut, but like I couldn't go to college. And so I think there's a relative element to this as well as an absolute element.
Yeah. I think the 200,000 year ago, you would actually outperform everybody now.
You get the point though.
But yes, I understand.
You understand the example.
Yeah.
Yes. True.
Yes. Is there absolute and relational? I think so. The challenge is that how does one determine absolute, estimation or absolute value? And
What's
so
a self, you have to do it for yourself.
Exactly. But if you do have one that's absolute, you should probably know what your criteria is.
Yeah.
So I think the reason why getting deeper into this concept of self-esteem is so important is I think most of us are blind to the criteria we're using to begin with. And if we like what is the when they come in to survey and determine the value of the house, what are their metrics they're using? And you said that they're like using quite a few different metrics, right? They're using probably how good the house was when it was built and how much wear and tear is on it. And like you said, the location and maybe the potential, right? There's a lot of different things that they're taking into account to determine its own value. And I think we do that with ourselves. I think that's an absolutely brilliant analogy. I think that we do that with ourselves, but we need to know what we're using to begin with. Like, am I using how attractive I am? Like physically attractive? Am I using, and by the way, that would be only something I would know based on the response of other people. So it would be relational value, right?
Yeah.
Right. Because I may or may not care about my own personal attractiveness, right? So am I using it based on how smart I am? Am I using it based on how much resource I can gather? Am I using it based on how kind a human being I am? Like, what are my criteria? So when a person is trying to determine what their self-esteem is, the best gift they can give for themselves is to figure out what are the metrics they're using to begin with and how many of them are relational.
Yeah.
You know, like if there is an absolute and a relational, which is the one that's getting the greater weight? And I would say based on our personality type, that answer is different.
By the way, I said relative, not relational, but that's interesting you couch it that way because that's probably your framework, right? It is about relationship where maybe for a extroverted thinking user, it might be relation to wealth creation for them or the career ladder they're on.
Yeah. Relative is a great word too. So my apologies for jerking it over into relational. But I think, you know, the more a person is maybe, like perceiver types that'll have introverted judging functions like introverted thinking accuracy or introverted feeling authenticity, the higher that is up in their stack or the closer it is to the driver in the car model, the more they're going to be using self-assessment as their guiding star, like as their first port of harbor. And the more they have an extroverted judging function, so like extroverted thinking effectiveness or extroverted feeling harmony, the closer that is to the driver position or the higher it is in the stack, the more they're going to use relative because that's how they understand things. They understand things in terms of its relative nature and how it, you know, impacts the ecosystem. But you should know what yours are.
Yeah.
Right. Like, or which one's better or worse? Neither, both, right? Like, it doesn't matter. What are yours? And which one is the one that you have a harder time assessing?
Yeah. Like
the lower a function is, the more uncertainty you're going to have around it. So how are you determining these things? Are you beating yourself up, not because you're not a good person, but are you beating yourself up because you have uncertainty around whether or not you're a good person?
Yeah.
Right. Those two things are not the same thing.
I don't want to burn too much good content here because I want to do an entire episode around self-esteem.
Sounds good.
But I want you to finish your thought.
Right.
But I just realized we're going to run out of time to hit some of these others, just kind of get a quick list before we go to the next episode. So I'm just kind of directing us right now in real time.
Are you saying that I get on a roll, Joel?
Well, yes. And I want to pause it because I think I want to unpack this more and I know we'll run out of time, everything. So I guess to land the plane on this then, self-esteem, we talked a little bit about this idea of absolute versus relative, but we also said that it's a assessed metric of some sort.
Right, exactly.
What that is may be different from each personality type, but self-esteem is an assessed metric of myself, both absolute and in relation to others. And
it requires a knowledge of one's metrics. And I think it usually requires tools, just like all surveying requires tools, right? So what are the tools we're using to determine that
social
estimation?
Media, it's the best tool use right? to use in this situation.
And then how often are we calibrating those tools?
Yeah.
Because there's no tool alive. There's no instrument alive that we use to measure things that doesn't need perpetual calibration.
Yeah.
So how often are we calibrating them?
The tools aren't absolute either.
Yeah. So that's self-esteem. And I think it's good to kind of lay that groundwork. It's like, well, we can't have anything else if our tools and our instruments and our reads are way uncalibrated.
Yeah. So you're listening along right now. We're talking about personality types and self-awareness. What is your awareness around your self-esteem? How are you measuring it? Are you measuring it in absolute terms? Is it in relative terms? Is it both? And maybe it's a percentage, like 20% relative, 80%, absolute, or whatever. How do you determine this? And maybe it's categorical. Now you've got different versions of this. Like, let us know. How are you aware of the self-esteem you have in your own life, your own personality, your own type?